stop me if this sounds familiar. You show up at a new LARP, you've got your kit, you've got your gear, you're all set to go, you've done check-in, you're waiting for game to start, game starts, you're super excited, and then all of a sudden it feels like everyone else is playing a different game than you because over the course of the weekend, everyone else is going on different plot lines. They're going off and having incredible fights. They're engaging with characters that you've never even been aware of that were at the event. And you come out of it at the end thinking, what just happened? Did I miss something? Am I playing the game wrong? The good news is there is a fix for this kind of thing, and we're going to talk about that today on Dungeon Discourse. What's going on, everybody? My name is Simon, and I'm here to talk to you about playing proactively, specifically in the field of LARPing, but also a lot of these lessons that I have learned over the years can also be applied to tabletop role-playing. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of overlap between tabletop RPGs and LARPing, since they're both just different forms of role-playing. LARP, you're just standing up and playing D&D in costumes. Before I jump into the details about what it means to play proactively, I want to make a few things clear about my assumptions and my context. When I'm talking about LARPs, I'm usually talking about weekend-long games that take place at a campsite in the woods. That's usually the style of game that goes on in my area, in New England, but there are obviously tons of variations. You might be playing a parlor game that's only a couple of hours. These weekend-long campsite games are the ones that I tend to play the most, and so obviously that's where my experience comes from. So take what I say occasionally with a grain of salt, but hopefully these will apply as universally as possible so that you can get the most bang for your buck. So, what does it mean to play proactively? It means that you understand that you, the player, are as much of a participant in the game as the GM is. Let's change tracks to tabletop role-playing for a hot second. In most tabletop role-playing games, people assume that they, the player, are there to receive the story that the GM is presenting to them. Players often think that they're there to experience a story that's set up for them. And the reality is that the GM can prepare all of these notes and all of these storylines and all of these cool characters, but players usually insert their own narratives anyway. You want to go across the way and see what's going on in that gazebo over there. You want to talk to that farmer about what's going on with the goblin invasion. We make these stories all the time anyway at the table. We still expect the GM to push the overarching narrative, but I think it's easy for us to lose sight of the fact that players are guiding that story as much as the GM is. If you look at indie games that are powered by the apocalypse, for example, they are excellent examples of games where the player is pushing the story as much as the GM is, because the player abilities often dictate things about the game world just wholesale. You don't need to ask to make a roll. Sometimes you can just introduce a story concept, and that's canon because you either have an ability or a move that lets you do that, or it's just baked into the game itself. During an investigation, if you find a person lying down in a pool of their own blood with a knife in their back, you could just say that person's dead, or you could say, I think there's still a pulse, at which point you would be prompting a move. Let's then shift that back to LARP. You may not have as much control over the specifics of the story in a LARP because of the logistics. Players are often in the game world. They're inhabiting the space. There could be 20 of you, there could be 60 of you, and there's staff that are usually operating out of a set space. And those staffers have to push out a lot of different storylines and cycle out a lot of different characters over the course of that weekend. They usually know the overarching narrative for the whole weekend. They know that on Friday you're going to learn about the big bad evil person's plan. On Saturday you're going to do a ritual that's going to break their magical defenses. And on Sunday you're going to have a big confrontation where you use all the information you got from the last 2 days and then have a big epic battle on the line, on the field, smashing into each other and breaking their spells and steel against steel, right? So in these kinds of games, it is just harder for you, the player, to introduce a story element and say, I've found some magical treasure underneath this rock, because staff may not have actually put a treasure underneath that rock for you, unless you're playing a game that has rules for finding your own components. That's a whole separate issue. It's a whole separate video. Those games are out there. They're very cool. I think the games where you have to actually find a physical prop out in the wilderness are also just as cool. What this means at a LARP is that you, the player, ideally are pushing the story forward by trying to meet the staff halfway with what the story is that they're trying to tell, as well as supporting your other players that are going around in the world and trying to generally elevate everyone else. This is an idea that's called playing to lift. I will put a link to a very good article down below there, and you can take a look and learn a little bit about what that means. Basically, playing to lift is an idea that I've also seen in improvisational theater. It's an idea where you are trying to make everyone else in a scene look better than you. That does not mean that you should do badly. It doesn't mean that you need to look bad. What it means is that you are always trying to carry everyone else in the scene, that you are taking what they're giving you and trying to provide additional information or boosts that push a narrative going forward. It's essentially just another twist on the yes and principle, which I'm sure many of you have already heard before, but in case you haven't, the idea is that if you always shut down someone else's idea in a scene, there's nowhere for the scene to go. If I say to you, "Oh my God, I'm on fire," and you say to me, "No, I'm not," there's nowhere for that scene to go. It's just kind of boring, and then we stare at each other awkwardly for 5 minutes on stage while somebody coughs and everyone gets on their phones. Now, if I had said, "Oh my God, I'm on fire," and you say, "Yes, and I have a bucket of water here, and I'm going to throw it on you, and now you're soaking wet, but the fire's out," in that instance, you have acknowledged the idea that I was putting out, as well as providing a solution which moves the narrative forward. So how do we apply this to LARP practically? Well, there are two angles that we need to consider. First one is more of a metagaming thing. It happens regarding things that are outside of the game, big picture things. The second angle is more personal, and that's the sort of thing that you can affect during the game itself. So first, let's talk about the big picture. A game ideally needs to provide its players with a sense of what that game is about and what kinds of action players are going to interact with. When I was writing my current project, Attaway, with my very talented team of 3 other directors, we came up with a number of sliders. These sliders would say combat on a scale of 1 to 5, social 1 to 5, role-playing 1 to 5, puzzles 1 to 5. We would place where we expected each of those different components on those sliders, give players a sense of what they could reasonably expect. Our game happens to not be very combat heavy, which is unusual for a boffer game, but that was the vibe we were going for. And another game all about being Vikings, ripping and tearing giants asunder in an age of Ragnarok, you're probably going to bury the needle on the combat slider. And that means when you're looking at a game, if they provide that information for you, you can adjust your expectations as to what you should be expecting and what you should be trying to see more of or engage with. If a game is very combat heavy, the solution to being more engaged in the game world is just to make a combat character. If that's not interesting to you, there may be less combat-centric options for you at that game, but it's also possible that that just isn't the game for you, and that's fine. If a game doesn't have these sliders for you, then I encourage you to reach out to the staff and the organizers and ask them what kind of game they run. Also worth checking with other players and seeing what kinds of plot lines and stories that they engage with. If another player tells you that, yeah, it kind of is a very combat-heavy game, probably adjust your expectations to do a lot of sword swinging. If they tell you that the game is a little more exploration and investigation focused, then you can start to think about the ways that you personally and your character might engage with those aspects of the game world. The other component to the meta-narrative, the big picture stuff, is negotiating scenes with players and staff. Negotiating a scene is that you preset with another person the way that you want a scene to go. Some people might be turned off by this idea because they really are excited by the idea of a game being entirely improvisational. That's fine. But there are certain topics and certain scenes that I think really benefit from having a strong sense of where all parties involved want it to go, what kind of tone they can take, and what kind of content they can reasonably put out without yucking anybody's yums. If you're negotiating a scene with people, let's say that I want to have a scene where I reveal to another character that I've been embezzling money from their business, I need to talk to that person and tell them how I expect that scene to go down. Negotiating that scene needs to be entirely consensual for all parties to feel like they're having a good time. At the same token, you can reach out to the organizers of the game and negotiate scenes with them and say, I really want to run a scene where my character gets corrupted by the demons that are in the game world. Maybe that removes your character from play. Maybe it opens up a whole nother option for your character. There's like a whole nother like side class that involves being turned into a demon or like a demon hybrid. Maybe it's something that the game just can't provide for you. But they don't know that. That's something that's interesting for you until you reach out and you talk to them about it. So if there's something you really want to see for your character or a part of the game world you really want to engage in, I highly recommend that you reach out to the organizers, send them an email and say, I would like to negotiate a scene where we do this, or I want to know how I can best engage with X. How do I do that? Let's talk more about practical stuff now. Let's talk about what you can do during a game to engage and play a little more proactively. Just like in any point-and-click adventure game, talk to everybody. When an NPC comes out at a game, they're usually there to seed some information, there to be a plot hook for something, maybe there to sell you components or items, or depending on the game, they might be there just for a gag. Talking with those NPCs can be a good way to fill your time, as well as a good way to engage with the game world. If you don't talk to anybody, you probably won't learn a lot about what's going on. People may think that you're not interested in the game itself, or you may be missing out on interesting opportunities for your character or you, the player. We often talk in certain circles of role-playing about things that my character would do. That's a dangerous road to travel down. I'm all about respecting and honoring what you think your character would do and the behaviors that they would engage in. But remember, you, the player, are also a participant in the game. You need to think about what is going to be the most fun for you. So, if you know that engaging with a certain NPC is not something that your character would probably do, but you think it's going to be a good opportunity for you, the player, to engage in something that you're interested in, go for it. Maybe your character is a very stern character that's always stone-faced and very serious and would never be caught dead doing any kind of goofy stuff. An NPC comes out that offers you a very absurd plot line that involves, I don't know, putting on a pair of fairy wings and running around and bopping people on the head with a little magic wand to turn them into pixies, or curse them with glitter disease. Your character would probably hate that, but you, the player, might love the idea of doing something like that. So, volunteer your character for that thing. Do the thing for yourself. Have your own fun. And the way you do that is just by pretend to be interested in doing the thing and then doing it anyway. Your character might be complaining the whole time about how the wings are itchy and how this wand is impractical for the purpose and, geez, all this glitter everywhere, it's never going to come out, but you're still engaging with the thing. If you're always stonewalling and never engaging with a plotline, you're just not going to have a good time. Unless you really do enjoy sitting by yourself in the tavern or in your cabin or in the woods and doing your own thing, that's fine too. But just know that LARP is often a very social activity, and if you are consistently not engaging with the things that the game is putting out for you, then either consider why that is, or consider if that game really is a game for you. If the plot lines and activities and NPCs that a game is constantly putting out don't interest you or don't engage you in any meaningful way, it's probably worth talking to the game directors about why that is, and considering if it just isn't your game. Here's another thing. Sometimes a game wants you to come to it, and sometimes a game will come to you. What does that mean? If you've played a boffer game in the United States, you're probably used to a trope where you roll up into game and you sit in the common area, whether that's a tavern or a trading post or anything like that. Everyone's sitting there playing cards, trading components, and waiting. We don't really know what we're waiting for, but we're waiting. Eventually, an NPC will kick in the door and say, "There's 1,000 goblins storming the castle walls. We need soldiers to come and destroy them." Or they'll kick in the door and say, "Oh, help me, my baby is missing in the woods. He's been stolen by werewolves, and we gotta rescue them." The story will come to you. And in those games, I highly recommend that you go out and engage in those plot lines if they're interesting for you. Even if they're not, they may be something to do and something to fill your time with. At other games, there will be plot lines that are hiding out in the woods or somewhere on the campsite, or an NPC that's waiting for you to say just the right thing or give them a special item. And in those games, it really is on you to be the proactive force. How do you know the difference? Well, you can probably tell right off the bat if a game is going to be one of those hurry up and wait games, or if it's more of a come and investigate me kind of game. You also can find out by talking to other players and by talking to the game directors ahead of time. You show up to a new LARP, you may find out that it's a combination of the two styles of running a game. But I think the most important piece of advice out of all of this stuff is that you have to be ready to make your own fun. Making your own fun just means that you have ways of keeping yourself entertained at a game, whether that's bringing a in-game board game or a deck of cards, that it's a certain kind of role play that will keep you engaged, such as telling people's fortunes, or constantly asking people to describe their nightmares and then drawing them in your journal, or having a character that is always hooded and wears a mask and you just enjoy walking around and being kind of creepy and mysterious. Whatever it is, having one of these activities will help you just fill the time. Before we wrap this up, I do want to go back to the idea of playing to lift and just touch on one last little thing, and that is trying to meet staff halfway when they present something to you. I have run a lot of plot lines where I have an intention for where I'm expecting a scene to go. Let's say I go out as an NPC and I want to rally players together to go fight some monster in the woods. I need to make it clear to the players that my goal is, number one, that they're going to fight a monster and that it has a certain number of resistances or has a certain threat level. Number two, how many people I need to go on that encounter, because logistically I may only be able to support so many people. And number three, if there are any specific characters that I need to go on that plot line. Maybe it's for a bunch of rangers who are specifically stalking a certain kind of prey. Maybe I need a certain player to show up because during that scene we're going to introduce some information that's relevant to that character's backstory. Player side, I think your responsibility is to engage with the staff member about the kind of story that they're telling and what those meta goals are. So if you can tell that they're saying, well, we really want this encounter to be for advanced players with very serious combat capabilities, or this is an encounter that is more social based, even if they're not saying it outright, try and read between the lines, then decide if your character meets those criteria, and if not, try and find the players that do. Sometimes those players will bring you along anyway, because they could always use some extra bodies, or your character might have some extra skills that are useful, or they know that you're a new player at that game and they want you to be engaged in the storyline. If you're a veteran player at another game, try and find those moments as well where you see that there's a new player that is struggling, that doesn't really know what they're supposed to be doing, that has been trying to figure out what plot lines they should be engaging with, or generally is having a hard time engaging with the game world. Bring them along. The staff member that's running that plot line understands what you're doing. They'll probably be fine with bringing an extra person along for the sake of that player out of game and their overall enjoyment for the weekend. Because all of us are paying for this service. All of us are paying to dress up in the woods and be an elf or a wizard or a robot. If you're not getting your money's worth out of the service, no bueno. That's going to do it for this video on playing more proactively at LARPs. If you have any tips or tricks that you want to give to other LARPers, whether they are beginners or stone cold veterans, drop them down in the comments. I would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe, and if you want to get notifications about when I drop more LARP knowledge, go ahead and ring that bell. You can also follow me on Twitter at LuchaLibris. And while you're on Twitter, please do consider checking out a new actual play podcast. It's called Voices at Play. They're at Voices at. They're a new actual play podcast that is by marginalized people, featuring games exclusively by marginalized creators. I think it's an amazing project, and I can't wait to check it out myself. So please join me. That's all I got for this episode. Hopefully your intelligence score has increased by the end of this video. Take +1 forward to use this information in your own future endeavors. Catch you all in the next video. Be well.